Well, evening all, and good that we're back again for what is the sixth session. We're moving towards the end of the series. Tonight we're looking at theologies in conflict as contested social visions, and that's a way of highlighting the reality that our theologies carry social visions with them, and if they're in conflict, then it's likely that the social visions will be in conflict. I think we'll see this in Amos, and hopefully as we explore this theme this evening. Now, the question would be at the beginning, who holds power and how is power used? And the questions can be asked of any group or organization: the golf club, the bowling club, the local parish, the ecclesial institution, the school management board, the local GAA club, the local Orange Lodge, the Rotary. The list is endless. Who holds power and how is power used? Now, public power is an extended dimension of this. Power is wielded everywhere, and often public power is administered by those who hold the wealth and control the flow of money and the legislation that controls the credit and the debt. Wealth means power, and power controls and makes the big decisions, including the military decisions. Public power works through the state apparatus, and there are concentrations of power which often follow one rule. Those with the money make the rules. Those who can make the most money increase their leverage and power and make yet more rules to control the rest. Now, behind such power is a social vision, and it is a social vision shaping society and how life is organized and goods and resources are distributed or not. Those who wield public power also tend to define truth and reality, and will often determine the national narrative and the historical narrative. This will include the history taught and learned, and especially the history not taught or learned, but sometimes airbrushed and denied and deliberately forgotten. In the Hebrew Bible, we meet those who wield public power. They are an urban elite, wealthy, part of a dynasty or establishment, which includes the temple or religious establishment, and a scribal class, who are the keepers of a particular historical and cultural narrative. In the Christian Testament, we meet the same establishment, dominating life from Jerusalem and or from Rome. This is not the only story. There is a counter-cultural narrative, a subversive power from below that will challenge the establishment narrative, sometimes subvert the arrangement of power, and publicly imagine a radical alternative. In the Hebrew Bible, the people who do this are the prophets. And in the Christian Testament, it is the narrative of Jesus and his followers, including Paul, and those of whom it was said in Acts 17, verse 6, they turned the world upside down. Publicly, they spoke an alternative truth to power, nothing less than alternative truth. They countered the totalizing truth and power of the establishment with a counter-truth that called out a counter-arrangement of power. They imagined, even playfully imagined, an alternative world. This is what we mean by the prophetic consciousness, the prophetic imagination, or prophetic tradition, though it never allows itself to settle into a tradition. So let's turn more directly to Amos, as Amos speaks truth to power. In chapter 7 of the book of Amos, there is a confrontation between Amos, the sheep farmer, and the priest of the central religious shrine at Bethel. Priest Amaziah is at the heart of the establishment, part of the power block of King Jeroboam, and the wealthy elite who rule Israel. Amos has pointed out that the king is on a slippery slope and will pay with his life for his military strategy, and the arrangement of power will disintegrate. And for many in the community, the future will be exile. Priest Amaziah orders Amos to go back home to Judah, earn his living there, and speak his truth to power there. This, says Amaziah, is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Maybe we should listen to the full text of this part of the Amos event. It's Amos chapter 7, and reading from verse 10 of that chapter. Then Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent to Jeroboam king of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, eat bread there, and prophesy there. But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock. The Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. Well, the priest describes the words of Amos as a conspiracy. It's treasonous language. It's liable, he believes, to demoralize the people and set them against the leaders and those who are in power. And Amos declares that he is not a professional prophet who can be hired for his services, as guilds of prophets were, and who usually told those in power what they wanted to hear. Amos is not being bought. The claim for the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom is a totalizing claim. Power is absolute and unquestioned. Truth and reality are definitive. But Amos persists. He will speak truth to power, subversive and alternative truth. Neither priest nor king possess totalizing truth or absolute power. God for Amos relativizes all human constructs of truth and power. Amaziah and Jeroboam are but penultimate and provisional, and the kingdom and the temple are not inviolable or guaranteed to last forever. No kingdom or system of power ever is. For Amos, God is radically free, never tied to any of our human arrangements of power or totalizing systems. Donald Gowan put it this way: when God chooses to bypass our institutions, it is inevitable that those who maintain them and benefit from them will resist, as Amaziah did. So the prophets always faced opposition, some of it severe. Well, the real clash at the Bethel shrine was between two theologies in conflict. And that was really a clash of two contested social visions. Now, maybe, Loretto, we can go to rooms for a first round of discussion. And the question, you'll see it come up on the chat line: who holds power in society or in the church? And how is that power being used? Who holds power in society or the church? And how is that power being used. We'll take 15 minutes and, and look at the prophetic consciousness versus the royal consciousness. And we've already encountered that clash at the shrine of Bethel, and that clash was not new. Amos, in fact, was working across two kingdoms divided after the reign of Solomon. Some very serious tax revolts had brought Solomon's empire crashing, and the kingdom was partitioned. Now, it did not happen in Amos's time, but the northern kingdom of Israel was to be completely wiped off the map and consigned to history by the military might of the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. In a very real sense, Amos had read the signs of the time and had warned of social and political collapse. Solomon had put a social, political, and religious system in place, an arrangement of power that lived on in consciousness and in practice well beyond those tax revolts and partition. Solomon created a royal consciousness that changed the very foundations of faith and life in ancient Israel. In 962 BCE, Solomon had inherited a kingdom from David, where a shift from the old tradition of Sinai was already set in motion. And Solomon set about building an empire, an expansionism that was totally self-serving and had only one aim, which was to secure the king and a royal dynasty. What Solomon did has been described in two ways. It has been described as a program of state-sponsored syncretism, and the king's achievement as a paganization of Israel. Well, that's strong language. Strong language for a king whose public press has presented him as the embodiment of wisdom. Now, 1 Kings chapters 1 to 11, written in the Deuteronomistic tradition, which is in the prophetic stream. 1 Kings 1 to 11 thought otherwise. Because 1 Kings 1 to 11 is written in satirical terms, it's a complete spoof on Solomon's reign and empire. Whatever social vision had emerged with Moses from Sinai, the covenantal vision, Solomon dismantled it and established a royal consciousness that pervaded and lingered in faith and life. Solomon created an empire of incredible affluence and wealth. 1 Kings 4, 20 to 23. Let me read those verses and we get an idea of what we're talking about. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate, they drank, and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. This guy has got a lot of territory. But here's the kitchen menu. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides harts, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. That's one day's menu. I'm not sure I would have wanted to have been the chef, the head chef in the palace kitchen. Well, that's Solomon's kitchen requirements for one day, and they suggest an insatiable appetite for food and wealth. And it was not shared wealth and food or resources. It was the monopoly of an elite, ensuring a growing gap between haves and have-nots. Solomon developed an oppressive social policy built on an elitist hierarchy and extracting money and goods from the poor. He introduced a system of forced labor where the poor worked for very little. And of course, they built the empire. The elite can never have enough wealth, power, or security. And unsurprisingly, 1 Kings 11, verse 28 announces a rebellion by the people, and by 1 Kings 12, the nature of governance and the role of leaders and people are all part of a huge struggle that will bring Solomon's empire crashing. Solomon has created an economics of elitism and a politics of oppression, and his security paranoia has increased the militarism and might to defend his and his elite's wealth and power. Expanding territory needs defending, and might is right, and the people must pay for it. Solomon then did what every empire does. He gave his economic, political, and military system theological legitimation. He built a splendid temple, modeled on the splendor of a Canaanite temple. Now we need to remember that Canaan in the Hebrew Bible is not a geographical location, but rather a symbolic reference to a social vision and arrangement of power and wealth and might. It is symbolic of an oppressive, totalizing system legitimized and legitimated by awesome temples and the Canaanite Baal. Solomon was a greater Canaanite, building a greater Canaan, and so a great temple was built, dedicated with huge pomp and ceremony, and with much prayer. Now we have established state religion, controlled by the king and blessing all of Solomon's predatory economics, his oppressive politics, and his military might. God and the temple dominate the royal landscape, serving the purpose of imperialism and the expansionist king. It's the classic instrumentalism of religion. The king controls religion. The king controls God, to whom the king has open access, and to whoever else the king grants access. 1 Kings 8, verses 12 to 13, the Lord has set the sun in the heavens, but has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell forever. Who can oppose Solomon now? Solomon has built an exalted house where God will live forever, and so the dynasty and the empire will last forever, longer than a 1,000-year Reich. For God and empire, God in the service of the king. No one can question Solomon's economics and politics and militarism. Solomon has contradicted everything Moses had brought from Sinai. The economics of elite affluence has abandoned the economics of equality. The politics of oppression has wiped out the politics of justice. And the radically free and liberating God has been instrumentalized, domesticated, tamed, and controlled. God is now in Solomon's image. A royal consciousness has been created, a theological and social vision, and all criticism is silenced. But another consciousness emerged with Amos, which would not be silenced by the priest of royal consciousness. Let's look at this alternative consciousness. Running through the Hebrew Bible is a dispute, and the dispute never goes away. It carries on into the Christian Testament and is met in Jesus' dispute with religious establishment and Roman imperial power. It is met also in Paul's running dispute in Romans and Corinthians with Roman imperialism. Paul was not anti-Jewish as he has been portrayed since the 16th century in particular. He was anti-Roman, as his frequent use of Roman imperial vocabulary in Romans and Corinthians show. And the dispute is between two theological visions, which, like all theological visions, are social visions. Every theological vision of God carries with it a proposal or a vision for the organization of social and public power. This was the heart of the confrontation and dispute between Amos and the priest Amaziah. It was royal consciousness versus prophetic consciousness. And it is a dispute on every page of the Bible. And it has not gone away. We are still engaged with it in various guises, including secular guises. We can replace royal with establishment or status quo consciousness, the mindset and the practice that refuses change in the systems and the structures of power and governance, and which serves the interests of the elite or those at the top of the pyramid. Prophetic we can replace with critical consciousness, aware of the need for greater equality and social and distributive justice. And critical consciousness will always be suspicious of attempts to silence criticism, or close down public discourse, or curtail the freedom of the press, or academic freedom, or make life difficult for the arts. In biblical terms, the clash is met in some of the royal psalms, such as Psalm 72. And the psalm sets out the requirements for good leadership. It's a political psalm. Dare I say, a political psalm, as all good religious songs and hymns and prayers are. Psalm 72 belongs to royal liturgies, and there is some irony, a great deal of irony, in the heading of the psalm, which is not in the original Hebrew, which says this psalm is of Solomon. Wow. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your people with justice. The poetry expresses a model for political leadership, any leadership and use of power. And the primary obligation is to maintain justice, and the justice is distributive, or as Walter Brueggemann has put it, Israel's fundamental covenantal vision, intending the sharing of goods, power, and access with every member of the community, including the poor, powerless, and marginated. The prophetic consciousness is always about a social vision with the practice of social justice at the heart of it. There is no community, perhaps, without it. No reconciled or right relationships without it. No common good or peace or social well-being without policies and practices of social justice. And Amos points to the recovery of an ethic of public justice and to the transformation of public power in the interests of community well-being. Now we've two questions for conversation. What critique would you make of Solomon's royal consciousness, especially his instrumentalization of religion? And where does this still happen? And then the second question, what is the essence of prophetic consciousness? And where in our society and world is prophetic consciousness in confrontation with a royal consciousness? And are we always aware that our theology contains a social vision? We'll see how that goes in 20 minutes of discussion, and then we'll come back for the final minutes of open conversation.